pretty much all the GPUs that came out recently have been very, very expensive. And then with all the focus being on these new cards, it kind of feels like you absolutely need a super expensive GPU to be able to have a decent gaming experience, which is not really correct. So, for the price of this one RTX 4080 from NVIDIA, I built this entire gaming system right here with everything in it. And keep in mind, all these parts are new, nothing is secondhand. So, let's talk about what kind of performance will this get you, and let's talk about some useful tips to consider if you want to spend even less on your PC, or if your budget is a bit higher, what would be the best thing to spend your money on. Let's begin. Here in the Netherlands, the MSRP of an RTX 4080 was about 1,450 euros when it launched, which is still a lot of money, even for a full system. So the idea here was not to make something that is super cheap, that barely works, but to actually put together a system that is good for 1080p gaming, that is decent for 1440p gaming, and that is also a very good basis for some possible future upgrades. Now, I decided to base my build around the Intel Core i5 13600K, which is a CPU with 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, and that is actually a really good all-around CPU. So it will be completely fine for gaming, but it will also be completely fine for some other creative things on the side, like using Photoshop or even editing videos. Now, it will cost you almost 400 euros here in the Netherlands, so on one hand, it will take a big chunk out of the budget that we set for this build, but on the other hand, it will provide a very good basis for a future GPU upgrade, for example. So when you do get a new graphics card, you will not have to replace your whole platform. You will be fine with this one for the next couple of years. For the motherboard, I picked the Gigabyte Z690 UD DDR4. Now, this board will easily handle this 13th Gen i5, and I picked it because it is pretty cheap for a socket 1700Z board, and I don't think it makes sense to spend more on a motherboard unless you actually need some specific features for your personal use. Ideally, I would have liked to go for the DDR5 version, but the DDR5 boards will cost you a bit more, and DDR5 memory itself is more expensive too. I got 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 3600 memory for about 100 euros, and 32 gigabytes will be plenty for a gaming rig that will last you for the next couple of years. Now, the i5 doesn't come with a cooler, so you do have to get a separate one. And since this CPU still can draw anywhere between 160 to 190 watts, you cannot really get a super budget cooler. So I went with the NZXT T120 RGB air cooler that matches this NZXT case. It costs only $50 or 55 euros, so it will perfectly fit our total budget here. For storage, I really wanted to get at least 2 terabytes. Going with 1 terabyte would be slightly cheaper, but with so many games taking up tens or even hundreds of gigabytes, it feels like 1 terabyte just isn't really enough for a gaming PC. You can pretty much pick up any deal in your own region, but I went with the Crucial P5 Plus, which was one of the cheapest 2 terabyte options, while being one of the better performing drives on the market. And at this point, I had about 550 euros left. So I split it up to about 200 euros for a good case and a power supply, and 350 euros or so for the GPU. And for this particular build, I actually went with the Intel Arc A750. To be honest, I was just curious to see how it performs and what is the general overall experience with an Intel GPU. But if you would rather go for an AMD or an NVIDIA one, I will talk about some similarly priced alternatives later in this video. And since the Arc isn't a high-power GPU, a good 550 watt power supply is more than enough for the system, so I went with the Seasonic Focus GX550 model. And last but not the least, this NZXT H5 Flow case. It is the latest in line of their clean-looking, good value cases. It is a nice mid-sized tower that easily fits all of these components without being too large for no good reason. It is also a well-ventilated case that comes with 2 fans by default, including this one at the bottom, which pulls the air straight to your GPU. And as you would expect from an NZXT case, this one is also very easy to build in, and it has nice cable management options in the back. Now that brought the total of the build to 1,445 euros, which is just under the 1,469 euro MSRP of the RTX 4080. But let's see how it performs. Now, in a short Blender benchmark, the i5 instantly shows how good it has become. With a render time of 1 minute and 39 seconds, it is only a few seconds behind the previous gen i9, and it is faster than a Ryzen 9 5900X and i9s from earlier generations. So for some occasional heavy CPU usage, this i5 is completely fine. When it comes to games, on 1080p resolution, the Intel Arc GPU holds up pretty well. Lighter games like CSGO, Doom Eternal, and Modern Warfare 2 will nicely make use of those high refresh rate gaming monitors. Now, CSGO had a bit of a problem with older Intel drivers, but with the latest one, it feels completely fine. And when it comes to heavier titles, they generally hit somewhere between 70 and 90 FPS, so that's also a pretty good result. On a 1440p resolution, however, things are a bit more difficult. So light games still show 100 plus FPS, but some of the heavier titles ended up around 60 FPS or just below that. Luckily, you can also use FSR on Intel Arc graphics cards, so you do get an upscaling option in most of these games. And then with upscaling, even the heavier titles are now nicely above 60 FPS. So even at 1440p resolution, you will get not the best, but a completely fine gaming experience. In terms of thermal performance, I set the fans to 40 decibels at 50 centimeters distance, which is what I would consider to be nice and quiet for a system under load. And in games, the GPU averaged at 72 degrees Celsius with 78 degrees on the memory. The CPU temperature was 67 degrees, the VRMs were at 65 degrees, and the case temperature was at 38 degrees average. And these are completely comfortable numbers for a system running a game. At first I thought it might look nicer to maybe add another fan or two to the front, but as you can see from these results, you really don't need to. Just the CPU workload was completely fine too, even though the i5 uses about 160 watts and the NZXT T120 isn't a super massive air cooler, it still managed to keep the CPU at just over 80 degrees with my personal fan limit, or just under it with the default fan profile, which ran a bit louder. So this too is a completely fine result. Now, since this was my first experience with an Intel Arc GPU, I wanted to use it for a bit longer to get a better feel of the overall experience. And I was actually surprised with how most things kind of just worked how you would expect them to. Just like with AMD and Intel, you just install the drivers and it all just works. The only issue I had was in Dying Light 2, where in some scenes the trees in-game would kind of change the light randomly, and I couldn't do anything to make that go away. So as always, there is definitely still some work to be done, but the overall first impression was quite surprisingly non-eventful, except for that one hiccup. Everything else was just working fine. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any issues in games that I haven't had a chance to test. So this is still a first generation product after all, and it is completely normal to expect some issues here and there. But if you would rather stick to AMD or Nvidia, here are a few changes that I would personally recommend. If we keep the same budget, so spending around 350 euros on a GPU, getting a Radeon RX 6650 XT would be a very good option. On average, it is a bit faster than both the Intel Arc and the Nvidia 3060, and you don't have to worry about being Intel's early adopter. So it would make the whole system a bit more beginner friendly, I would say. Now, if your budget is slightly higher and you have a 1440p monitor, I would look into an RTX 3060 Ti instead. The 3060 Ti is a bit faster, and if you're spending more on your GPU, other benefits like DLSS and RTX will start adding some more value to the whole mix. Another interesting option, especially if you want to save some money, is getting a cheaper CPU. The Intel i5 13400 and 13400F just launched, and those will save you about 150 euros, plus possibly another 50 because you could match it with a cheaper B660 motherboard instead of going for a Z690. And that extra money could nicely go towards a better GPU, for example. That being said, the 13600K is definitely better, especially if you also do some heavier work, and it should age better over the years. Because if you plan on using this whole system for the next couple of years and you just want to replace a part or two on the way, the 13600K should just hold better. Same as going for DDR5 motherboard and DDR5 memory, because well, it is not as expensive as it was when DDR5 memory launched, so if you can spend another 50 to 70 euros more, I would definitely go for a DDR5 board and 32 gigs of DDR5 memory right away. Finally, I would probably suggest buying a 650 watt power supply. Now, this particular build doesn't really need it, but most of the time the price difference is insignificant, and this will also make it easier to upgrade your GPU to a higher class in the next couple of years without having to also buy a new power supply. I think that's it. I think that's where I'll leave it today. I really hope you enjoyed this build. Let me know in the comments down below if you liked it and what would you have done differently. There is no one solution to builds like this, and I'm always curious to see what others would choose instead. And last but not the least, a huge thanks to NZXT for sponsoring this video and for sending out the case and the CPU cooler. Bye guys, and see you in the next one.